So we have special guests tonight. We have Jamie and Aspasia Leonarder. And I was just saying to them before we started the meeting that I'm surprised that we've been in the same circle for so many years, but we've never actually met face to face. So I'm really pleased that they're here tonight. And Jamie and Aspasia, I've asked them to come along and speak about their involvement in the UFO field through the years. But a little bit about them first for people who are viewing this on YouTube is that they initially met as therapists some years ago, many years ago, I believe, when they were working with disabled and mentally ill clients. And they have this long-term interest in anything anomalous, as I've discovered, and have their own independent archives in their home where they've got hundreds of books, papers, films, records, and lost media. And they're not just interested in UFOs, they're interested in all types of anomalous experiences, because I've been doing a bit of snooping on you guys, you see. So they organised the first Australian interview with Bob Lazar, and they've currently got a weekly visual podcast on the Untold Radio Network in the US called Down South Anomalies, which is viewable on YouTube and contains some of Australia's best researchers talking about the subject. So let's start at the beginning, you guys, with how each of you became involved in the world of the anomalous. So so tell us how you two got involved individually and then collectively. I could say it like that.
Where do we start?
Well,
I think it's difficult for anyone that has an interest in this topic. I had an incident at school.
Yes, you did. Yes.
But, I think being part of that baby boom world, and excuse me for stepping over you there, that's the great slings and
just sitting back here.
Arrows of marriage and knitting. Look, I think part of that baby boom generation, I was born in 1958, my wife a couple of years later, marked us in a way because we're all part of the space race.
Oh, yeah.
So we're already thinking in a sort of cosmological way about the world around us. And then, in the late 60s, I had an incident not as profound as Westall and not documented at all, but it was at my public school where at lunchtime we all ran out and there was an adjacent double football field. And just over the picket fence, the paling picket fence, where you could stand up as a child on the bottom rung of the picket and look over, there was a massive floating ball that we were told later by the teachers and the staff was a weather balloon. It was the lowest floating, weather balloon. It stayed in the same spot for over an hour. Only ever Sheryl spoke to someone maybe 10 years after that incident that remembered it as well, and I've forgotten their name now, and the incident's become quite blurred in the course of time. But I can tell you it was no weather balloon, and what it did was spark something inside of me, and I became voracious to actually find out literature. And I think at the age of like 10 or 12, I was absolutely shocked. This wasn't just some sort of science fiction motif, some apocrypha that had fallen off the pop cultural apple cart. It was more than that. And then all the literature I was reading, I was realizing that there were, on the boards of UFO groups throughout the world, there were heavily credentialed people with intelligence and military backgrounds. And I thought, well, this cannot be just some figment of the imagination. There's got to be some factual evidence to this. So I think that's what kicked me into the phenomena.
Yep.
And, the astounding thing like you have with your beautiful late husband, when I found my wife, and we've been together for 32 years, she was so open to this phenomena. She had read quite a bit of literature on that. It just ignited that flame. When you find someone that lets your soul be free and doesn't contaminate you with their own bias, but is happy to see that you are passionate about something constructive, interesting, and possibly existential, then we just sort of sung with that together.
We
We
did.
dived
We
into the
actually did.
topic
Yes.
together.
Yeah.
Mm.
And it was actually joyous to be able to do it with somebody who, you can bounce, talk about things and bounce off each other, and it's not just, you don't go down your own, tunnel. It's just something that you can, discuss and really explore. And when things sound a little bit weird to you, and that other person says, yeah, I don't really, you kind of go, yeah, no, I didn't think so, but hey, we've got to be open to all of it. Look, I got into it actually through my father, because when I was younger, I was watching shows probably beyond my, what, for my age, things like, especially in the 70s, that whole the In Search Of, and because my dad didn't speak very much English, I had to sit with him and be his translator. So I was watching things that if it hadn't been for my father, I probably wouldn't have been in there watching. And so, after you've watched a few In Search Ofs, you kind of, start to think, oh, maybe there's something really going on. And then when you talk to other people who didn't watch it or weren't into it, and they'd be going, no, 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 you'd be thinking, hang on, did they just make up all that stuff? What's going on here? So I was always open to and my dad being Greek as well, we had this whole thing about, the evil eye, and that sort of like esoteric that other people didn't understand. But my dad used to explain it all to me, and it's like it was part of my culture. So it's like, yeah, sure, of course this is real. So
Yeah.
that's my dad was to blame.
Your father also had experiences back in Greece.
Well, he
Now,
did.
you migrated here when you were about 7 or 8?
Yes, I was 7. But my dad did have an experience that he actually hadn't related to me until much later. When he was telling Jamie about it, a few years ago. And it was about having heard something. He never actually saw something, but he heard some sort of a machine, some sort of this would have been in the 40s, on the island where he lived, on Lesbos. And he was sure, because he used to say, do you think, he'd ask Jamie all the time, do you think that there's really UFOs? There are flying saucers? And Jamie would say, well, yeah, sure, I'm open to things like that. I definitely think that there's something, going on. And so he recanted this story of having been in the mountains, and he heard this what at the time he didn't realize was like this not even a plane, but
I think what he said to me, he heard the sound of wind pressure being pushed apart really rapidly.
Yeah. So and by the time he got over the mountain there, and went and had a look at it, there was some sort of a circular indentation in grass or vegetation. And so that always stayed with him, because he didn't know what it was and what was going on. So it was weird that he had actually never said anything to me when I was younger, but, recanted this story to Jamie. So,
yeah. Well, I'm not surprised that, if there was something that was of extraterrestrial origin, for example, that you've gotten involved in the field, in the research as well, because, you've got that predisposed to that open-mindedness anyway. But
absolutely.
I just find people, I got involved because at one stage I sort of got actively involved because my father-in-law was a member of the organization many years ago, but I always had an interest. But just moving on from those earlier days, I'm not sure what happened between when you two met and then how you came to what came first, Jamie, for example, with you creating that To Catch a Flying Star, which actually was published on an audio cassette, and was actually so popular it sold through the ABC bookshop. And I have a copy of that, or had. I don't know what I've done with it, sorry, because you said you'd autograph it for me one day if we ever met. But
You
when
don't
did
need
that?
my autograph, but what you do need is we're going to put it up in a digital form on the Untold Radio podcast soon and do some behind the scenes stories about that.
Yeah.
Look,
Yeah.
I'd always been interested in media as well, and I was a strong proponent of public radio, public television. So I did a lot of work in Sydney around those two areas, and eventually that drifted me into work at the ABC. I worked at Triple J for a while. I was H.G. Nelson's producer there in the late 80s. And I drifted back and forwards with that. And I began to realize, Sheryl, that these stories, the biggest frustration for us, especially being therapists,
Sure.
is that these stories are very difficult for people to articulate. There was so much ridicule. There still is, even with it being out on the level that it is today. And you know what? Media is an astounding thing. When it comes to ratings, it is so amoral
Oh, yeah.
that it will put anything on. So it's a matter of coaxing them. But I wanted to do this properly to catch a flying star. Still, you know, if I can say this without coming across as a narcissist, I think it still holds up. I actually listened to it this afternoon after all these years, and it still holds up as an audio documentary. But I wanted to make sure it had a good scientific basis and it had a good eyewitness count, not necessarily what people say are credible people, but people that are everyday people that people listening could identify with. And also the tenacious nature of Australians, Indigenous, white Australians living in the outback, living in one of the harshest continents in the world. These people are true pragmatists.
Yeah,
They know their environment. If they see something that's a little different, they're going to tell you. But they might tell you and just move on in the next 2 minutes. So I thought, I'm going to be sneaky here. I got friends with Matthew Leonard, who was an award-winning producer, still is.
Yeah.
And amazing journalist. And I convinced him and Radio National, the most credible program at that time, to give it a shot, to give me a chance. And I would fund an expedition into the Nullarbor with a couple of colleagues of mine, and we'll go down there. And one of those colleagues was an infrared specialist, excuse me, and had believed that they were actually seeing repeat Earthlight phenomena down in the Euclid Basin. So we decided we're going to go down there, and that's going to become part of that documentary. So I think that's what led me basically into that period. I've sort of always dallianced with media. I think it's really important that we get out there as researchers and investigators in the greatest delivery system we can. And television, film, radio, podcasts can get it to such a larger community. And in some way, that's going to stop all that blowback.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree with that. And I wanted to dive into actually some of the stories in To Catch a Flying Star, because I listened to it again about a week ago. And I think in an early podcast that you did, you said that I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you went there because of the Knowles family case, where the family was in the car and it was lifted up off the ground. Is that correct? Is that why you went there? That
was part of our motivation, and that was an incredible case. 1988, family of 4 lifted up off the Air Highway just outside of Mundrabilla, that's very close to the Western South Australian border there, which is a scary place in itself because it's so isolated. And we were down there with a lot of, as I said, infrared film, and we had it in the back of the car covered in silver alloy. And the police down there were a certain group of police that had sort of burned their bridges everywhere else. And I believe just prior to us being there, it might have been when we were there actually, that a few of those police were actually doing some pretty skullduggerous things. And they were sort of deregistering cars and pushing them back over the border and getting them sold and leaving the person in that car, even though they were defaulting them. So it was a hairy place to be, very isolated place to be. But as I said before, the tenacious and pragmatic nature of people living in that environment, the Knowles family, that incident occurred directly in front of the opening gateway to one of the largest properties out there. It was over 1 million acres, the Mundrabilla homestead. And of course, that homestead was about 3 kilometers back from the air highway. It occurred directly in front of that, and there had been extensive research. John Ockertell, Keith Basterfield, numerous people had researched this. And there've been all these weird conclusions coming up in the press, like they had hit a cattle ramp and gone up in the air. Because at one stage, let me think back to that case. Do you want to narrate what happened? Do you remember the whole nature of the Knowles case? Do you want to narrate that?
Oh, I'm a bit.
Okay, this family of four is driving along the highway.
Mum and the 3 sons.
And they're actually, you know, unfortunately, their economic and educative status was used against them. And this is what angers me deeply, because these people genuinely had a weird experience. And, you know, I can't absolutely state that it was truly anomalous, that it was a UFO experience, but it is an extraordinary case, and they were distinctly shook up. You know, the exploitation was so rife, and that I believe, I'm not 100% sure of this, that their car was sold out from underneath them before they left the Nullarbor. It was taken off them, it was signed away, and it was to be exhibited like it shows around the country, and they didn't even realize that had happened.
They'd signed
That's
something.
how badly they were being exploited. So I started hearing these stories that they'd hit a cattle ramp out there. Well, I can tell you from spending many nights with the family at the Mundrabilla homestead, there is no cattle ramp crossing the air highway. If you have cattle out there, you are one of the luckiest graziers in the world, because the environment is so dry and harsh. And all these years later, and I'm not going to say who told me that, but it is also in pockets full of dangerous things like strychnine, which were used as a way to curb what was told by the governor of the day the indigenous problem. And that strychnine is still in the ground. So you're lucky if your animal life is going to live past a couple of months, maybe a year of age. So they didn't hit a cattle ramp. Let's get that out of the way. So they were driving along. They were fleeing an emotional situation. And that's been held against them. I think there was a small amount of alcohol in the car that was held against them. And all those things are completely irrelevant, because there are numerous other witnesses to something similar to this. And I think there was
a truck driver, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I think there was an incident in New Zealand virtually identical at the same time. Bill Chalker would be aware of the ins and outs of this case. It's a bit foggy for me now. So I went out there. It was years later. This program went to air in 95. It was probably about 94 that I was out there. So 6 years later, the Roadhouse, and Roadhouses are amazing things. I don't know if you ever had a look in your early days of research, but you'd have to buy all those exploitative magazines like the British Mirror, Picks People, and John Pinkney would write a little story at the end about everything from the Nullarbor nymph to ghosts to UFO stories. And that's where they fell. They fell into those areas. That Roadhouse was covered in ephemera about the Knowles case, midnight sightings, weird experiences, ghostly orbs, earth lights. That was a hotbed. And they had coasters, T-shirts, tea towels. I went a bit crazy there over those things. But you know what? They were still experiencing phenomena out there. We documented and photographed something that was very similar to the research that Trevor James Constable and Wilhelm Reich were doing with what you'd see now today in films like Nope, which was the trope that they used there, that there were these space critters. We filmed these things on infrared down in that basin. It's just an incredible area. And, you know, the most beautiful thing, Sheryl, is to actually go down there. And boy, did I have more than one drink with the person who ran the Mundrabilla homestead. That was a bit freaky. But I thought I'd better get down and just, you know, enjoy the hospitality of this individual. And he's narrated to me an incredible story that's not on To Catch a Flying Star, but I'll tell you about that. I don't think it is on.
No, it's not.
Okay.
Yeah.
They had, as I said, 1 million acres there, and they weren't running cattle. They were doing all sorts of things. But on top of the escarpment, and I know all of us know the ubiquitous photos of the cracked desert plain. So you go up this gigantic cliff face that was a couple of 100 meters. And on top of that escarpment was just flat, cracked land. And that's where we camped. But they had their water tower up there. And so they're having a problem with actually getting water out of that tower one afternoon. And they had a young boy that was like interning to them from Western Australia. And they said, we thought he mightn't be up to the job. He was a bit of a girl. He was wearing a bandana. And I thought, oh, well, thank God I didn't put mine on. But anyway, they said he came flying over that arroyo in their mini moke, screaming that there was a solid flying saucer object taking all the water out of the water tower. He could see the water going up. It was dragging the silt out of the bottom of their water tower. So there was dirt and stones, and this was sticking to the bottom of this craft. He saw embedded hieroglyphs, and he was so scared he'd actually cut all his hands. He was bleeding. And the property owner said to him, well, what's going to happen with the water? We need the water. I don't care what's up there. And he goes, but right up there at the moment is this craft, and floating next to it is a transparent being. And you know what? That kid never got back in that mini moke, but the 8-year-old daughter did, and went up to the water tower. And by the time she got up there was nothing there. And they tried to alleviate the problem, getting water from another bore and area. But it was just endless stories like that. I mean, at first I was really worried. So what I'd talk about is the Min light. I wouldn't bring up flying saucer, UFO, and today UAP. But I spoke about that, and the floodgates were open.
They were. I actually didn't go with them. I had to stay behind and, hold down the fort. But, when he came back, Jamie said to me that they were actually hard pressed to find somebody who didn't have a story. If you ask them about Min lights or Earth lights or something like that, they were hard pressed to not get to have somebody that didn't have an experience out there.
And you know yourself, Sheryl, that those people living on the land, their pragmatic nature is joyous. It's hilarious. And they know when there's something different in their environment, whether it's on their land or it's in their star field. And I can tell too from my therapy background, when you're dealing with someone who's been a bit traumatized by a bit of consensus reality collapse, that when they recant that story to you, it's like they're reliving it. And so you can see that fear and apprehension in them. And that always makes me, because my background training as a nurse and stuff, it always makes me extremely empathetic to them and wanting to hear that narrative, no matter how wild that narrative is.
Because sometimes those narratives are wild.
Yes. Well, I know what you mean about people living on those properties, because my father did too. And he very much a pragmatist. And if if he said something happened, you can take it to the bank. Yeah, exactly. But I was interested when I was listening to it. There was a mention of a fellow called Bob, and he was at the home of the mine manager at Broken Hill when he saw a light in the sky that disappeared. And later comments by mine workers were that it was following the line of lode, which is one of the world's largest bodies of ore containing silver, lead, zinc. And I just wondered, what were your thoughts on why UFOs would follow that line?
You know what? That is a fabulous question. I love you for picking that out. And that was one we were excited to put that in the documentary. To this day, I'm not sure. There's an extraordinary relationship with these incidents and water. There seems to be an extraordinary relationship with these incidents and underground tunnel systems, mining systems, lines of load. Pro Heart in the council chambers there in Broken Hill, and I'm sure if it's still there, but Pro Heart had an incredible painting of an object he'd seen in the town.
Yeah.
So, you know, Broken Hill has numerous stories. Now, here's an odd thing that occurred to us, and that we, in the evolution of our thinking and looking at this subject matter, and it's best I state now, especially for your group here, that we might have started off with partial hypotheses in terms of our investigation, research, or assistance. I can no longer hold any hypothesis close. I'm just sort of broadening out, and I think we both are.
Yeah.
Because whether it's, there always seems to be an incredible personal connection, especially to close encounters, that people feel like they're in the middle of a city and an object marks them out. And maybe they see it and lots of people around them don't. And they feel consciously aware that this has some connection to them. So I think it's really important that, you know, I step back from that hypothesis. But we were driving out to the air highway to investigate the Knowles case. That was going to be our sine qua non in the midst of To Catch a Flying Star. On the way there, a major meteorite incident occurred in Broken Hill as we drove through. And people that we spoke to in the town, even though the local paper, the Barrier Daily Truth, was trying to debunk it as best as they could, people, locals, were saying this was no meteorite. And, you know, New South Wales is the only state, and I don't know if this law has changed, but back then, and this is 28 years ago, gee, I should get up to speed on my law with that stuff. But the only state that if something falls from the sky, you can legally recover it and claim it as your own property. In other states, it is the property of the government. Within hours, federal police from other states were coming in and roping off people's lawns and removing bits of debris, although no one could specifically tell you fires had started where this object had actually gone down or what bits of it had gone down.
Or what it was.
And we had to leave there. We had a schedule set in our mind, which we should never do that. We should have just stopped there and stayed for days. We had this reason we were going there for the Knowles case. When we got back, we ended up spending an entire week in Broken Hill. We got footage. I tell you what, they weren't meteorites. They were like triangular-shaped objects that went over there. Some major event occurred. And in the end, the local police, I caught them out. And they said it was barbecue fire starters in those box kites. But we found out that the one that had been photographed coming down, I think it was in Cobalt Street. They have great names for their streets there. The one that was coming down was actually created by the police. So we found that out, and we managed to get on the cover of the paper and cause a bit of a scandal before leaving town. It's also, do you remember that scene in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, where they get out of the bus and they're on the Monday Plain? That is the longest, flattest plain in the Southern Hemisphere. And we spent a night out there with locals that have witnessed extraordinary things on that plain. They had seen massive telescoping
conning towers
appearing out of nowhere and collapsing into themselves and moving up and down. And that was a wild night. At one stage, I had a Holden come screaming up with a husband who grabbed me around the neck and said, "You just want to sleep with my wife?" And I said, "No, I genuinely am trying to investigate a UFO story out here." So, you know, it's amazing, but that's an incredible area. It's remarkable.
Yeah, there's a lot going on out in the middle of Australia and other parts of Australia that, let's put it this way, that are not on the coastline, anywhere that's not on the coastline.
Exactly.
I mean, most of the population lives on the coastline, and there's some incredible things that are reported. I wanted to ask you, actually, did you ever speak to any of the Indigenous people about some of the things that they might have seen?
Yeah, and there's a couple of them in the audio documentary. And it's always important to me, and we did this with our Untold Radio podcast, that we go back to the Indigenous community before we start. because they have a much higher awareness. But we have to be aware too that some of these stories are absolutely sacred to them,
Yeah.
and the trust needs to be rebuilt, and that some of these stories are just not for the public world to
They're
exploit.
not for public consumption. Yeah.
So we had Matt from the
Matt Pole. Yeah.
Matt Pole.
No, but in the
doco,
To Catch a Flying Star, you
I
had,
think we had
had an
Norm
Indigenous
Grogan. Norm Grogan had actually witnessed the Midnight with his family, and we had Duke there as well, who was an Indigenous truck driver.
Yeah,
he's passed away now. I think it's really important, and you know what? You've just triggered my memory. There was an incredible case out there with an Indigenous police officer who could literally, and you must have come across cases like this, he could literally call the phenomena down. So, and he'd had a massive breakdown, and I was trying to get to him, not to interview him, but just see if I could just have a chance to talk to him. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough time. But there were stories of him getting into trouble with his police division. He's probably the most upholding police officer there, because a few of them that I met really were scoundrels. They ruined all our infrared film at one stage. They said, "You guys are carrying drugs," and ripped all the alfoil off it and spoiled half the infrared film we were using. But
exposed it. Yeah,
he had moments where there were incidents involving police cars that had been damaged, and I don't think anyone had documented or investigated those cases. So I always feel like there's an incredible link, especially historically, and we all know this through what we've seen of Indigenous art and cave paintings, but in their culture, the Wandjina, all of that stuff. And I think it's basically the second or third episode of Untold Radio we do that people can look up on YouTube. Untold Radio Down South Anomalies, Matt Pole, who was the Indigenous curator there at Sydney University for many years.
At the Macleay University.
Part of his job was to actually check on other museums for Indigenous art.
He's been going over to England and retrieving, Indigenous artifacts and, bones and stuff, and bringing them back to Australia to be, reburied and stuff since.
And what I can glean from the Indigenous perspective is where we are now with moving away from a hypothesis is that there is a vast spectrum of anomalous phenomena, and that phenomena can take shape and form in any way it wishes to. I mean, from the Yowie stories right to the Bunyip stories, right to the Min Min light, I think is derivative of the spirits of the dead, and it's just incredible. It's an absolute pantheon of extraordinary experience. So I believe that, if you go and spend some time in an Indigenous community, you speak to these people, you build up trust, you'll probably get your greatest insight into what we're dealing with here. And I think us out on the fringes in Western white popular culture, we're sort of, we've been in the shadows because we don't have a religious or cultural template to fall back on. My wife does in her Greek culture. We don't. We have reductionistic science that keeps making the box smaller and smaller.
Yeah. Just to shift away from that a little bit, a lot actually. Going back to you organising the first Australian interview with Bob Lazar, how did that come about, and when did it come about? I don't remember that. And did it make it into the media here at any time?
It ended up being it was for a pilot for a television series that was going to be called Conspiracy.
It was called
Conspiracy, but they were going to do a whole series. And this was the pilot episode. And so what year was that? It was 96. 95, 96. 96, yes. It was 1996.
Now, some people may have seen that were around then. It premiered on Channel 10 at prime time, and it rated its socks off.
Yeah, it was a really high rating program. And it was at the time that the Mulder and the X-Files was on too. So it would have been actually a perfect time, but I don't know what happened. It just
You know, it's the luck of the draw
eventuate.
in the world of television. And if
Yeah.
you've got someone there who's passionate behind it, it's very hard to get someone who's not yourself passionate about this subject matter in that world of media that's always ridiculed it.
So it was a television, it was a production company that came to us.
And it was also our director.
Yes, Brendan, yes.
And Alex.
It was Alex Proyers who did Dark City AI, The Crow. It was his production company, and another one that came to us to get Jamie to become to do research, because they knew he knew about the subject at the time, and so he was going to be the main researcher on this program. And of course, you know, it was like, well, you've got to go to the States and you've got to you know, interview Bob Lazar, because he's telling us that, you know, the government's got, you know, UFOs and they're back engineering them, and, you know, all that kind of stuff.
This is the wildest thing. It must be wild for you two now sitting here today, like 24 hours after Congress up there on Capitol Hill has done another public hearing. You've got 3 incredibly credentialed people, and everyone's going, this is it. It's the breaking point. But, you know, we have been through this breaking point so many times. There was so many smoking guns, and I'm fuming with the fumes of that stuff, but not the truth of it. Bob Lazar was an amazing story. There's always an uplift every decade in the world of popular ufology, whether it's a fabricated uplift or a real uplift, it really doesn't matter. And Lazar was like something we'd never seen before. And Lazar did one thing. He exposed a facility that for many years people didn't believe existed, that had been so heavily secret. And that was Groom Lake, Dreamland, Area 51, S4, no matter what you call it, that whole Nevada test range had been secret up until that point. But something I've always been heavily suspicious about the Lazar story is at the same time, there were cases being held for the illegal destruction of toxic materials within those bases. Now, these were closed court cases, but they were receiving press. So people were beginning to learn about the facility. And those stories went to the back page of the local Las Vegas newspapers as the Bob Lazar story took over. And isn't it incredible? And now I'm not saying, you know, I've got a fondness for George Knapp, but isn't it incredible that George Knapp, this is like 30 something years ago, now today, there he was sitting up there on Capitol Hill with Jeremy Corbell behind our 3 whistleblowers. And I'm thinking, good heavens, these stories always come out of Las Vegas?
Obviously.
But where the Bob Lazar story started, oddly enough, is not with Bob Lazar. It's with the estranged son of John Lear, the son of the father that invented the Learjet. And he was a bit of a problem child. That's why he was sort of cut out of Dad's will, I'd say. And he was an interesting fellow, but he'd already been talking to George Knapp about some of the most freaky stories to do with that area and underground levels.
The things that he was saying were just absolutely horrendous. I actually went along to a meeting. It was called Astro in the very early 90s. And there was a tape of John Lear talking about this facility, and there was all these levels. And, you know, on level 7, it was called the nightmare level. And that's where they had, you know, they were cutting up people's body parts and joining them with other. And I was like, listening to this tape going, who is this guy and what is going on here? You know, it was just the most horrific stuff that he was actually out there, you know, pushing. And then here he is now. He was with, you know, Bob Lazar, and I thought, who is this guy and what is his agenda?
And Bob Lazar at that stage was just John Lear's, I think he worked in a photo store. He was the guy that sort of, you know, got his films processed and, you know, within a couple of weeks was a bit of a skeptic on the subject. And then he came back to John pretty quickly after. But we sent a film crew there.
Yeah.
And that was a friend of mine, Brendan Young. He went on to do a documentary on us for SBS called Love and Anarchy, about us and our creative life. People can look at that on Vimeo, but he was an extraordinary person. He was a bit like me. He would keep an eye open everywhere for inconsistencies. So the one thing that happened when he got to Bob's house was that the tester model kit that had come out of the supposed, anti-gravitic saucer that Bob was working on, they were up to the ceiling, Sheryl. You can barely get through the front door.
Yeah.
So he was selling, and that's fair enough. Maybe that was just finally he's got some fame for this. The bathroom was covered in imagery of Deborah Harry. He had a real thing for Deborah Harry from Blondie. Bob Lazar. Here's a bit of behind-the-scenes dirt on Bob Lazar. He had all over his fridge. He had stickers saying those tickets that you stick down saying I need to buy another 5 polo necks,
because that's all he ever wore was polo.
And my director was saying, is this guy ever out of a polo neck?
No.
He ate in the same Italian restaurant every night, the same meal. So Bob's an interesting, odd little character there. And Bob was never as credentialed. We couldn't find out whether there were real credentials or not. At that stage, too, that I had the film crew then, he was being done for pandering. I think he was just installing like computers into a brothel, but they blew that story up a bit more extreme. But, there's always that double edge. And to get this interview at that stage with Bob Lazar, we had to go through a secondary person called Gene Huff. And we had to pay $1,000 US. The one thing you do when you've got a film crew doing a documentary is you do not pay for interviews because it'll never stop.
Yeah.
But the trouble is we couldn't
Couldn't
get
do it
Bob Lazar unless we paid for that interview. So, I'd love to think Bob was genuine. I've got no idea at this day whether he is or not. I think Jeremy Corbell did a very interesting documentary. I don't know what Mickey Rourke is even saying halfway through that documentary.
Well, I was going to mention that to people who are here, who some may be new, that some may not even know who Bob Lazar is, but go and have a look at the documentary. I remember him speaking. I remember when he first came on, it was a documentary, I think, and he drives up in this 2-door sports car and he gets out and he says, there's something about UFOs in Area 51.
That was his tape. Yeah.
That was my first understanding of it.
Yeah, and people, I think, can look at that up on YouTube. It's called the Lazar tape.
Yeah, the Lazar tape.
And I can remember we waited for that.
We purchased that.
Our big thing was we used to love prior to the internet is just writing to everyone.
Yeah.
And we'd even write to some of the kookiest contactee organizations and just, there were numerous researchers out there that said, don't dismiss all of it,
No, don't dismiss any of it.
And the contactee movement can hold some great truth. And, in many ways, I now realize that's even more important today than ever.
Absolutely.
It's just so odd how here we are all these decades later, and we're seeing this thing brought to the surface more than it ever has been. But we're hearing the same narrative.
Yeah. I know.
Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed.
Exactly. Actually, I was going to say to you that I sort of feel like we're in a situation, talking about how UFOs are a threat, right? And we have these whistleblowers coming out and saying they're a threat. And I first thought when they were saying that with Lou Elizondo, that they're using that as like a fulcrum to get some leverage to get people to pay attention, right? To the subject, to people in higher places to pay better attention to the subject. But what I've noticed is, because it was presented as a threat, that it reminded me of back in the 90s when there was a great division in the UFO community about that perspective of whether extraterrestrials were here for the betterment of humanity or whether they were here for nefarious purposes. And I thought this is how the conversation is going to go now. And I thought, gosh, this is just going to be a repeat performance of that, because it was a very divisive time in the UFO community. You couldn't have a different opinion. It was, a lot of it was driven by, I felt at the time, by Richard Boylan, people like Richard Boylan and Stephen Greer, who said that they're all here for the betterment of humanity. And I thought, well, that's not a really balanced perspective, I don't think, because I was talking to a lot of people who are reporting abduction experiences, and they were traumatized. And not everybody, but a lot were still pretty frightened, and people were sleeping with axes and knives under their bed because they didn't want anything. They wanted to protect themselves. They couldn't go to sleep without the nightlight on, all this sort of stuff. You would have heard that too.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I mean, I had people in the media, and to this day, I can't tell you their names, but very well known television and radio people that were having experiences. And they were waking up outside of their apartments. They're waking up with their clothes backwards. One of them actually had their child, who was very young, found outside the apartment. So I totally agree with you. Extremely traumatizing. And you don't want to initiate any more fear. But I think the biggest problem, Sheryl, how can we generalize about something that appears, after a little bit of research, to be so highly complex, and it appears to have a unique relationship with every person that's experienced it?
Yeah, that's true.
Look, this whole thing now about UAPs being dangerous and a threat. It's like, I'm sorry, but you can't be in the government and come out after all these, since 1947, and all of a sudden be telling us that they're a threat, when up until now you were denying that they even existed. You kind of can't have it both ways.
Yeah, they're a bit in the corner, aren't they?
They are. They have backed themselves. It's like, well, up until now they didn't exist. And now all of a sudden, and at every time there was an incident, they would come out and say, there's no threat here, there's nothing there, there's nothing going on, move along. And now it's like, oh, you need to give us more money so we can defend you because they're a threat. It's like, yeah, I don't think so, mate. You need to pick a lane and you need to stick to it. No, truly.
Yeah.
It's like, I can't believe anything you say now.
Yeah.
Because it's been deny, and all of a sudden,
But I mean, really, it's so preposterous. If we are dealing with an advanced technology, and at times it really does seem like that, even though it can sort of change very rapidly, that by now we would have seen, if this was a threat, something really extensive happen. And what we're seeing more than anything is complete confusion of how to deal with this. And I always hate those things that dig down and just extend the defense budget yet again. We need to get past this notion of aggravation and war and conflict and borders and start to unite here. I mean, there's those incredible moments, and I don't want to recant the words of Ronald Reagan, which I'm sure he didn't know he was recanting properly anyway, but there is those moments where, if we started, Stanton Freeman, I think, said it, if we looked at ourselves as human beings, as earthlings, and dumped this notion of borders and segregation, and were open to the difference in everyone, then maybe we'd be able to come up with some solution to this, or just accept this extended notion of reality. But I think we live in a much more mysterious, much more profound world. And I think our biggest problem is that we've been conditioned from a very early age to not believe that.
Yeah.
And we want to thank you as an extraordinary researcher, and for just giving so much to your community over the years, and being so open-minded, Sheryl. It is an honor to share this podcast with you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Sheryl. It was very good. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
it was great. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
see you next
Sheryl.
time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.